So we explored template variables and how you, for example, can use them to extract input values when the form is submitted, as we're doing it here. But of course, you can use them and the access to DOM elements they give you in any way you need. What's worth noting about these template variables is that they don't always give you access to the DOM element though. Here with title input, it is the HTML input element we're getting access to. And for the text input here, it's the HTML text area element. But if I were to add a template variable to my button here, maybe called btn, then the type of value that's stored in that variable is button component, not HTML button element. The latter would be the case if I would not have this app button attribute on the button, which turns this into an instance of my button component. Without it, it's not, and then indeed it is a HTML button element that's stored in that variable. But if I add that attribute, Angular takes over control of that button and in the end turns it into an instance of my button component, because my button component has that as a selector. And if that's the case, if you're dealing with an instance of a component you defined, and you then place a template variable on that element in your template, so on that component element, like here on this button, then it's actually that component instance that's stored as a value in that template variable, not the underlying DOM element. That's important to note and be aware of. And the same would be the case if I would place it on one of my app control items. Then it would be that instance of my control component that's stored in that template variable. And then I could access all the methods or properties of my component instance here when working with that template variable. So that's just something to note, that by default you get access to the DOM element, but if you're putting the template variable on one of your components, then you get access to the component instance instead. So you did learn quite a bit about template variables already. And now I want to build up on that and use a template variable to reset that form whenever it is submitted. And then building up on that, I'll show you a different way of getting hold of the value that's stored in the template variable. But let's start simple. Let's make sure that we get access to that form through a template variable. To do that, you can add a template variable to the form element. And I'll name it form, but of course the name is up to you. And if you hover over that, you see that it is the DOM element, the HTML form element, the object that is created behind the scenes for this form here that is stored in this template variable. Therefore, if I want to reset that form whenever the form is submitted, I could pass that form template variable as a third argument to onSubmit. And in the onSubmit method, I now just have to accept it. And accept a form parameter, which is of type HTML form element. And then we could use this form parameter to call the built-in reset method on that HTML form element object. Because the object that's automatically constructed by the browser in the end for this form element does have such a reset method, which does what the name implies. It clears all the input elements that are inside of that form. So in this case, this input and this text area. Therefore, with this code, if I save that and I go back to my application, if I enter something here and I click submit, you see those inputs are cleared thereafter. And that happens because of form reset. Now, that's nice to know, but that's not the main thing I want to show you here. Instead, it would be nice if we could add that template variable here and then get hold of it inside of that new ticket component without passing it as an argument to onSubmit, so that we don't have to pass all the things we want to use in onSubmit as an argument to it. Of course, we can do that, but I want to show you an alternative. And that alternative can especially be helpful if you want to access an element that has a template variable on it in some code that's not triggered because of an event. So where you can't pass the template variable easily as an argument to some method. So to simulate that here, I'll remove form as an argument from onSubmit, and I no longer expect to get it here as a parameter, and therefore, of course, here form now is undefined or can't be found by JavaScript in the end, because there is no variable called form available here. But there now is a different way of getting hold of that element in the DOM that has this template variable on it. We can get hold of it by adding a new property to this component. For example, a property called form, but the name is up to you, of course. And by then decorating this property with the viewChild decorator, which must be imported from @AngularCore. Now, the viewChild decorator is a decorator that can be used to select elements in the template of this component and make them available here in this component class. ViewChild therefore is a decorator that helps us find child elements in that component's view, so in that component's template. To do that, ViewChild needs a selector as an argument. And that selector can be a string, and I'll show you what to put into that string in just a second. But it could also be the class name of one of your components, like button component, for example. If you would use such a class name, then ViewChild would look for an instance of your button component in this template, and here it would find one. And it would then store that instance in that form property here. So then you could interact with that button component instance via that property in this component class. And that can sometimes be useful. You can also not just pass component classes here, but also classes of directives, but that's not something we need to do here. Instead, another pretty powerful way of using ViewChild is to pass a string to it, and as a string value, you pass one of your template variable names. So for example, form. You can't pass a CSS selector here, so something like that won't work. You can't select elements by CSS class, but you can pass the name of a template variable. So by passing form here, without the hashtag, I'm telling Angular that it should look for an element with a template variable called form on it, and then it should store the value that's stored in that template variable, or the value of the element on which this template variable is placed, therefore, in that property here. That's how that works. With that, you then just have to tell TypeScript which type of value will actually be stored in that property. And that would be an element ref. So you must import element ref from Angular Core and use that as a type for this property. Now, the element ref type just defines the type for a wrapper object, though. Because Angular in the end will wrap the element it finds with help of that selector in such an element ref object. And that's why element ref is actually a generic type that needs extra information about the type of value that will be wrapped by it, here when using ViewChild. So you give it that extra information by adding angle brackets here. And then between those angle brackets, you define the type of value that will be wrapped by element ref, which will be the type of value that will be selected by that selector. So the type of element that will be selected by it. And here in this case, that will be an HTML form element. So that is the type that should go between these angle brackets. Last but not least, you should add a question mark here because this property here will not immediately be populated with a value. Instead, when this component class here is instantiated, no template will exist yet because Angular won't have initialized it yet. And therefore, initially, this will indeed be undefined, and it will only be populated with a value once Angular has initialized the template. That's why, for example, in the constructor, you would not be able to access this form element yet. But that's no problem because we need access to it here in onSubmit. And we can now get access here by using this.form, so by using this property. And now we just need to convince TypeScript that this will be defined so that it will not be undefined. And you can do that by adding a question mark here, which tells TypeScript that it should only try to access the reset method if this here is not undefined. Otherwise, it will not continue, so that it won't generate a runtime error. Now, I'm still getting an error here, though, that reset does not exist on that type, because inside of the form, we store that element ref object, not the HTML form element. Instead, that is wrapped by this element ref object, so we first need to access the native element property on that element ref wrapper object, and that will then be that HTML form element, so there we can then call reset. And that's therefore a different way of getting hold of an element that is stored in the template inside of this component class, here with help of the viewChild decorator. With that, if you save everything and you reload, you'll see that if you submit the form, it is still reset as it was before.